Hi, I'm Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made this conservatory that I'm going to use in my next stop motion animation. It's going to be uploaded at the end of May 2022. I'm going to show you all the techniques and processes that I've used to create this entirely by hand and from scratch so that you can adapt it to your own design. And I hope you enjoy this video. On a project like this, first I like to play around with the mock-ups. So take some cards, some paper, and start to get an understanding of what the proportions are going to be, the layout, and try to figure out how I'm going to build this thing. So having a mock-up and play around with it, going back and forth until you have the right shape, the right design is absolutely crucial for me. The most complicated part of this build was the roof, and I needed to play around with some bits of basswood and some tape to get an understanding of how I'm going to build this. After a while playing around, I felt more confident to start tackling the actual build. I took my paper template and copied it onto plywood, one for the base, one for the ceiling. Then I cut it with a jigsaw, and I also cut some studs. Then I lay my plywood base on the studs. You notice the stud I cut at an angle to follow the shape of the base. I like for them to come up to the edge because they're going to be essential later on to hold the wall straight up. I take my time to position them correctly and then use the nail gun to hold them in place. So as you can see, I've got my platform that is raised because it's for stop motion animation, so I've got enough space underneath to access the screws underneath the puppets. I cut another piece of ply for the wall. I've attached some stud at the front of it that match the width of the base so they can slide directly into it. I've also added more piece of stud at the back so that the whole wall is freestanding. I decided to add a piece of plywood on the other side so I can add some carpet and create the interior of that wall. Then I've got the second layer of plywood for the roof. It's wider and bigger than the initial base, and once you add the walls it makes sense to have that proportion. So I've started adding some wool, cutting them at an angle so that it can fit, drill them and screw them against the studs. I wanted to make sure the front part will be modular so I can still remove it and access for the camera through it to shoot the animation. Then I've applied some contact cement on my plywood, and I've also applied it at the back of my sheets of EVA foam. I wait 5 minutes until they stop being tacky, and then I assemble them and try to remove as many air bubbles as possible. I like to have a piece of foam that is bigger than the plywood so I can apply it and then trim the edge so I have a nice clean edge. I've done the same thing for the base, apply some contact cement, and then bond those two pieces together and trim the edges. Then I reassemble things together, start to add the small walls on the side, realize I've glued the foam on the wrong side of the big wall, so I went back out and have to do it again. Then I finally have the foam on the correct side this time, and then I slide and reassemble those pieces together. Now before building the walls up, the most important thing is to make sure they're perfectly square. So get a tri-square, triple check every single wall, because if your base is crooked, the whole thing is going to be off. I know some of the walls are going to be attached together and I had a little bit of gap here, so I just add some wood filler, let it set and sand it down. So now to build the wall, I've used some basswood 10mm wide and start to cut them. I took the measurement of the lower wall and then used the marking gouge and mark a notch all along that bit. Then I can use my little Japanese saw and cut it out all along the line that I just marked. And soon you're going to understand why I've cut this notch. Marking gouge is such a fantastic tool, and I've used it throughout this project because you can really adjust those little nails coming out to the right depth, and once you have it set you can just apply that measurement to every single bit of wood to copy it. So that's just a brilliant tool. So I've copied this cut many times on lots of bits of basswood, and then I start to assemble my wall. So as you can see, it's a nice fit against the wall. I use the pencil to mark exactly where they need to go, and then use some super glue to place them exactly on the right spots, and start building my wall one batten at a time. Angle was a bit more tricky, so I had to take my time to sand it down and adjust it at the right angle and make sure it was a nice fit. I kept adding more batten. I had some mark with a pencil on the other side of the wood so I knew exactly where they need to go, so I have a nice straight line, and kept building it up until it go to the top. I continue on the sides, doing exactly the same thing, and by the time I finish at the front I can just add a bit of 3mm basswood with the super glue to create the skirting. I start to work on the bigger wall, adding some basswood on the edge of the plywood to cover it. And then I've added a little trim all along the door opening to create a nice design with different width and thicknesses of basswood. I've added the skirting as well to make sure it matches with the rest of the room. And then I repeat the whole process for the outside of the wall. So now if you start to wonder why I've done it that way, it will soon make lots of sense. So I just repeat the whole thing and cover the whole outside of that wall with the same system that I've done before. Up to the top button, then doing on the side. That means I have a tiny bit of space in between those two layers so I can slide my piece of clear plastic through it. Because when you work on a structure like this with so much glass, I didn't want to have to fiddle and cut every single piece of glass, and then you usually attach them with super glue, which is at risk of turning white and create some patches. So I didn't want to have to fight with it. I thought if I create a system where the plastic panel just slide into its little pockets, job done. It's going to look much better, cleaner, and the job will be simpler to do. And I'm so glad I've done that. Then I start to work on the roof, adding my big piece of plywood, then cover all the edges with trim made of basswood. Make sure they line up correctly. I've also added another trim on the inside, and then I have to figure out how to do the higher part of my roof, which was very tricky. So I took lots of bits of basswood 5mm wide and start to cut those buttons to the right size. The most complicated part was cutting the angle and adjusting back and forth until it fits all around it. Once I was happy with them, I just add a bit of tape, and basically it was a dry fit, so it holds it in place for now, so I've got more time to do all the other buttons all around it. And this was a really patient work just to make sure I have this really odd angle, and every single button seems to have a different angle to them, so that was very tricky to do. And once I was happy with those, then I took the super glue and attached them in position. And there you have it, first part of the roof done. So that was brilliant. I'm really happy with that part. Now I wanted to create the same system that for the wall, to create a pocket where I can just position my plastic glass. And that means I need to recreate a second layer for that ceiling. So first I work on the frame. I start to work with a little piece of basswood and I use some spacer. As you can see, the little triangle there. Looking back, I wish I took some spacer a bit bigger so I have more margin to work with. I've also added some brown tape to make sure that the super glue I'm going to add to hold the frame together is not going to attach to the layer underneath. Once I was happy with all my wooden bits, I can start to use the super glue to hold them together, make sure I have the spacer in position so that all the frame has enough space to allow for the clear plastic that's going to come later. Then I can take the whole frame out, so I was happy with that. And then I have to work with really thin basswood for the second layer. That was very tricky. As you probably noticed, I've added much more brown tape to make sure that nothing will attach to the layer underneath with super glue. And then it works! I had my second layer done. It was very thin, very fragile, so I was very careful with it. And I decided to add a bit of trim at the top and also on the sides to cover the edge of the clear plastic that's going to come in. And there you have it, the top layer of my roof, the second layer, so the whole thing is removable. I can have some nice shot for my animation from above. And I also make sure the front wall was removable as well to access with the camera. Now there was one part I still needed to build, is the front garden. For that I used another piece of ply, reused the paper template that I made to create the base, to create the nice shape, and adjusted until it was a nice fit. Underneath you had some stud so that it's exactly the same height than the rest of the sets. Then I started working on the tiling. For that I used a pen and marked the lines. I went outside with the mask and gloves and used a wood burning tool to carve into the foam. Then I prime it with the white gesso. I start to work on the wall in a similar manner, mark up my line with a permanent marker, then go over it with the wood scouting tool. And then I wanted to add some texture, so I mixed up some sand, proper builder sand, with some PVA. Then I apply the whole texture throughout and remove what got into the groove with the sculpting tool. And I let it set overnight. Now while that was drying, I went back to working on the front garden. For that I used some piece of cardboard and a hot glue gun to create some volume instead of just having a flat boring base. Then I cover the whole thing with duct tape. I cover the conservatory with some cling film and then slide it back in. I've used some Sculptamol. It's basically papier-mâché with a bit of plaster in it, so it dries a bit quicker. If you have just papier-mâché, that will do your job as well. It's just going to need a bit more time to dry. Then I mix it up with water and start applying it throughout. That means I can create a nice shape all around the conservatory that feels more organic. Then I smooth up the top with my finger. If you add some bit of water, that helps as well. And then I can just remove the whole board and let it dry completely. Then I start on the paint job. First, I prime the wall with white gesso. Then apply 2 coats of acrylic paint. Use the little sponge to add more colors and make it more interesting. Then I've protected with a clear matte sealer. Apply the grout with some diluted acrylic paint in a contrasting color and remove quickly the excess with a wet paper towel. Once it was completely dry, it still needed a little bit of touch-up, and then it was ready to be protected with a clear matte varnish. I've done the same thing for the rest of the conservatory, painting the wall first, then painting the base, 2 coats of acrylic paint every time. I've also added a bit more colors with a sponge. Protected with a clear matte sealer. Add the grout with a contrasting color and remove all the excess quickly with a wet paper towel. I've done some washes with brown as well on every single wall and remove the excess with a wet paper towel. And then I protect it with a clear matte varnish. Once that was all done and dry, I can start working on the glass panel. So I've used some clear plastic sheets, cut it to size, remove the protecting layer, and then I can just slide it into it. Oh boy, I was so relieved to see that my system worked, and it makes the job so much easier, quicker, and it looks cleaner at the end of it. The roof was a bit more tricky to do. First, I made a pattern with paper and I kept adjusting the paper template until it was a nice fit, and then I can copy it with permanent marker on the piece of clear plastic. Do the same thing for every single part to make sure they were nicely fitted to each other. And then I've added as little super glue as possible, 2 little dots at the bottom of it, and that's it. I didn't want any risk of having the clear plastic getting whiter because of the reaction with the super glue. And then I can position the top part of my roof above it. Now it looks like a perfect fit on camera, but there was a bit of a gap and I had to fight with it with super glue. So that's where I wish I put some spacer that was a bit thicker so I have more margin to work with. But hey, there's one thing you can always do, and that's what I like. If you have to fight with super glue and you have some stain, just add some washes, pretend it was supposed to be there. It's a roof, it's dirty anyway, so you just apply some diluted acrylic paint, remove the excess with a wet paper towel, and pretend it was always meant to be there. So now going back to my wall, inside of it I've painted as well and add a bit of fabric to create the carpet. Then I can reassemble all my parts. The element that was still missing was some doors, so I took a piece of card, add some tiny hinges with super glue, cut some piece of clear plastic to create the glass, and then add some balsa wood all around to create the paneling. Now let's tackle the garden at the front of it. Once the Sculptamol is completely dry, I apply 2 coats of acrylic paint and then use a static grass applicator and some grass glue. I buy a bunch of static grass in different lengths, from 4mm to 7mm long, and different color as well. It's always nice to mix it up. It creates something that is more realistic and organic. Then I apply a little patch of my grass glue. Fill up the static grass applicator with my grass. They often come in lumps, so it's always best to separate them so they're going to apply better. Then I switch it on, and then with the wonderful magic of this machine, with the current, it creates an application where the grass is standing up. So that's just brilliant. Honestly, it's such a fantastic tool. I really had fun using it. And then you remove all the excess with a vacuum that I cover with some tights, and that means you can reuse and it's not gone. You can reuse it for the next layer, for example. Then I've done the same thing again, add more patches of glue, then create another batch, different colors or maybe different heights of grass, and apply throughout, and repeat the whole thing until the whole surface was done. Now, to add some interest and avoid having just grass there, I've reused some leftover from the previous project. If you look at my tutorial of how to make the outdoor scenery for the cottage, you can see that I've made those with some seafoam, spray them with glue, and then apply some turf on it. And you can make them with different colors, so that's much more interesting to work with. So I can just play around, add more glue, add them to it, add a bit more flowers to add some colors as well. I think it's nice. I mean, it's not you're not obliged to add those stuff. I just think it makes it more interesting. Now I'm going to talk about the little flower pots. I took different cylinders and shape inside of my workshop and then start to play with one of my favorite material, wobbler, and basically warmed the piece of wobbler and wrapped up around all my shapes. If there's a bit of gap at the bottom, it doesn't matter, you can add a bit of wobbler later on. And then I slowly fold the top of my shape to create this rounded edge. Do the same thing all along the tube and then let it cool down. And if you repeat the whole thing with different width, with different height, you can really have some lovely variation flower pots. It's always best to make more than what you think you need, because I can guarantee they'll be used very quickly. Then I use some white tack to attach them to leftover piece of foam board so I can prime them and paint them in different colors, and then I can fill them up with the hot glue and use a bit of soil that I picked up from the garden to press into it. And then I use those flowers already made, which is rare for me, but they look absolutely adorable and they're gonna save me forever instead of having to make them from scratch. I bought them for Model Scenery Supplies in UK and they are just so adorable. So I just made a hole in the middle of my pot, took my little flower, dipped them in super glue, and then pressed them into their pots. And then I knew I wanted to display some of those flower pots on the wall and having some shelf, which requires to have little brackets underneath. So for that, I used some flat wire, cut it into sections, and then round the edges with a metal file. Then I bend them at a 90-degree angle, so that's the first part of my bracket. Then I took another piece of flat wire and then with my jewelry pliers I've created a little swirl for that part and a lovely shape that's going to fit nicely into the first angle bracket that I made. Then I needed to super glue them together, so I've applied some brown tape because the super glue is not going to attach to it, and then very carefully dip into the super glue and then position it against the other piece of wire. And if you have one of those super glue that have an activator such as Miter Bond, that's going to make your life much easier. And I've copied the same thing 6 times. On that wall, I've positioned my door. It's always a bit fiddly playing with those tiny little hinges. And then once they were a nice fit, I realized I can create a doorknob with just some nails. Perfect to create a doorknob. Then for the shelf, I super glue some piece of basswood that I've painted in brown acrylic paint, position them on my wall, and then I can super glue my little metal bracket that I've just made under them. Now I'm going to talk about the furniture. I've created the base of my sofa with some basswood, I think 5mm thick and probably 10mm thick for the feet, and I've also created the little table out of basswood as well. For the cushion, I've used some EVA foam, 10mm thick, and I've cut all the edges to round them up. Then I've placed my foam above a piece of fabric that is much bigger and used the hot glue gun to apply some glue throughout and then fold the fabric onto it, and done the same thing all around. Then I can glue my cushion to the main base that I've painted. For the side cushion that are rounded, I decided to recycle some piece of cardboard that you have inside of the aluminium foil wrap or cling film and cut them to size. I used some hot glue to be able to attach some EVA foam at the end of it, cut it and sand it down. Now I carefully apply some fabric to cover the whole thing. And then I still use the hot glue gun to attach it to the sofa. It does the job, it attaches it, but it's quite thick, and so it's going to create a little gap, and that's what I noticed later on. So I decided to use a thick cotton string to just cover the edge so it looks a bit cleaner. And then it was looking too new and fresh, so I used my sculpting tool and I had a real go at it to try to age the fabric, distress it a little bit so that it looks more realistic. As you can see the difference with the one that I haven't touched yet, which looked too firm, too straight. This looks a bit more real and have some age to it. Then I decided to add a bit of cushion with some fabric and cotton. Because of the color of the fabric that I've used for the sofa were quite dark, I thought it's nice to add just a lighter shade. A little bit of color and whiteness, it softened the whole thing. And then it's just come to dressing the set, which I always enjoy. I place all my furniture with some white tack underneath, so they hold in place nicely. And just keep at it, adding more flowers, more bits and bobs here and there. Close up the roof. And there you have it, your conservatory is ready for you to enjoy. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Next time I'm going to show you how to make a formal dining room by hand and from scratch. Take care!